At dawn, beneath frost-glazed hemlocks beside a quiet Vermont pull-off, a state trooper paused over footprints that ended abruptly at snow-darkened water, the air metallic with winter, the scene sealed by silence, evidence waiting, breath held, Christmas lights distant, an ordinary patrol turning irrevocably investigative before reports began to spread. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Vermont in December of 1999 carried a particular stillness that longtime residents understood without explanation. Snow came early that year, pressing sound flat against the land and forcing towns inward. Holiday wreaths hung on courthouse doors. Local papers ran community calendars beside stories of heating costs and icy roads. It was in this muted seasonal rhythm that the disappearance of 22-year-old Emily Harper first registered as something slightly wrong, then deeply unsettling. Emily lived in the outskirts of Rutland County, a place defined by winding two-lane roads, wooded hills, and modest farmhouses spaced far apart. She worked part-time at a small outdoor outfitter and supplemented her income with seasonal shifts at a nearby inn preparing for holiday guests. Friends described her as steady, independent, and rooted in routine. She called her parents every Sunday evening. She rarely deviated from her work schedule. When Thanksgiving passed without incident, nothing suggested that December would end differently. Emily was last reliably seen on the evening of December 10, 1999, leaving the inn shortly after closing. Snow had begun falling again, light but persistent, the kind that erased footprints within hours. Her car, a well-maintained compact sedan, was later found parked at a pull-off near a secondary road used mostly by hunters in season and maintenance crews when weather allowed. The vehicle was locked. There were no obvious signs of struggle inside. A scarf lay folded on the passenger seat. For investigators, that detail mattered. It suggested intention rather than chaos. The initial response followed protocol. A missing adult bulletin was issued locally. Flyers were printed and taped to store windows and post office boards. Radio announcements described Emily's height, clothing, and vehicle. Family members organized searches, walking tree lines and riverbanks with volunteers bundled against the cold. The state police assumed lead due to the rural jurisdiction and the growing concern that weather would complicate recovery of evidence. Early interviews focused on the predictable circle: coworkers, neighbors, former classmates. No accounts indicated recent conflict or fear. Financial records showed no unusual withdrawals. Phone logs revealed no suspicious late-night calls. Her apartment showed no disturbance. The thermostat was set low, as if she planned to return soon. Christmas gifts, partially wrapped, sat on a small table. For older Vermonters following the case in the local press, these details resonated. They spoke to interrupted routine, to a life paused mid-season. Search teams expanded outward methodically. The nearby river, partially iced, drew attention because of its proximity to the car. On December 12, a trooper noticed the disturbed snow that would later be described in reports with restrained precision. Footprints approached the bank and stopped. There were no corresponding prints leading away. The water below was dark and slow, edged with forming ice. The scene was secured. Specialists were called. The decision to treat the area as a potential crime scene marked a shift from hope to grim probability, though officials remained careful with language. Recovery efforts were delayed by weather. Ice and current required equipment and personnel coordination. When Emily's body was found downstream days later, investigators documented the location with photographs and measurements before transport. The autopsy, conducted at the state medical examiner's office, revealed findings consistent with homicide without unnecessary detail released publicly. Cause of death was determined through internal examination and trace analysis. There were no indications of prolonged suffering. Toxicology returned negative. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window aligning with her last confirmed sighting. Forensic analysts noted fibers and particulate matter that suggested contact with a vehicle interior not her own. These details were logged, preserved, and quietly waited upon. The community response reflected the era. Candlelight vigils were held on the town green. Churches included prayers during Advent services. Local reporters wrote with restraint, emphasizing verified facts and official statements. For a demographic accustomed to trusting institutions, the slow, careful pace of the investigation was both reassuring and frustrating. Leads came in steadily but proved unreliable. A reported sighting at a gas station was discounted by time stamps. A tip involving an out-of-state license plate could not be substantiated. Winter hardened the ground and locked potential evidence beneath ice. By early January 2000, the case had cooled in public perception, though it remained active within state police files. Detectives rotated assignments, reviewing interviews and timelines. Emily's routines were mapped in detail: routes she drove, places she stopped, times she called home. The pull-off where her car was found gained renewed scrutiny. It was determined she had no known reason to be there. Traffic studies showed minimal use at night. That fact narrowed possibilities. Investigators theorized an encounter that redirected her path, possibly under the guise of assistance or authority. This line of reasoning was informed by patterns seen in similar cases nationwide during that decade. Evidence storage became critical. Fibers collected from Emily's clothing were cataloged. Soil samples from the riverbank were compared with known locations. A partial latent print lifted from the exterior of her car door was deemed insufficient at the time for identification. DNA technology in 1999 was advancing, but limited in scope and speed. Biological material recovered yielded a profile that could not be matched to any entry in existing databases. It was preserved under strict chain-of-custody procedures, a decision that would later prove decisive. Years passed. The case was reviewed periodically, often in winter when seasonal staffing allowed detectives to revisit unresolved files. Emily's parents aged. The flyers yellowed in storage boxes. The town changed slowly, storefronts coming and going. Yet the file remained, thick with reports, diagrams, and photographs taken under fluorescent lights. In 2015, as part of a statewide initiative to re-examine cold cases using updated forensic methods, Emily Harper's file was selected. Advances in DNA analysis and expanded national databases offered renewed possibility. The preserved samples were resubmitted. Analysts worked quietly, aware of the weight carried by cases that had waded through so many winters. In late 2018, a partial match emerged through a genealogical database accessed with proper warrants and oversight. The profile suggested a familial connection to a man who had lived in Vermont briefly in the late 1990s and later moved out of state. Records placed him in Rutland County during December 1999. His employment history included seasonal work requiring night travel. Investigators reconstructed his movements using archived pay stubs, vehicle registrations, and contemporaneous traffic citations. The latent print from Emily's car was re-examined with improved imaging and found consistent with his fingerprints on file from a later unrelated arrest. Surveillance and interviews were conducted with caution. The suspect, now in his 50s, was approached years after the crime. He denied involvement. However, lawful collection of a DNA sample confirmed the match to the preserved evidence. Additional corroboration came from witness re-interviews. A former coworker recalled a conversation about helping a stranded motorist near a pull-off, a detail previously overlooked. Faced with the evidence, prosecutors moved forward. In 2021, the suspect was arrested and charged. The case, once buried under snow and time, returned to the courthouse where wreaths again hung in December. The legal process unfolded without spectacle. Plea negotiations considered the age of the case and the strength of forensic linkage. Ultimately, the defendant entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder, sparing the family a trial. Sentencing reflected statutory guidelines. Emily Harper's name was spoken in court with formality and care. In the quiet aftermath, her parents released a brief statement expressing gratitude to investigators who had not forgotten. For the community, closure arrived not as relief, but as a sober acknowledgement that patience and procedure, sustained over decades, can still reach truth. Winter settled deeper over Vermont as January advanced, turning roadside snowbanks into gray walls and pressing daylight into a narrow window. Inside the state police barracks, Emily Harper's file remained active. Its tab moved forward on the shelf rather than back. Investigators understood that the weeks after a discovery were decisive, even when answers refused to surface. They reconstructed December hour by hour, using weather records, traffic data, and time cards from the inn where Emily worked. Snowfall logs confirmed that visibility on the night of December 10th would have been reduced but not hazardous. Road maintenance reports showed plows had cleared the main routes by early evening, leaving secondary roads passable but quiet. This mattered because it suggested opportunity rather than accident. Emily's movements that day were consistent with routine. She arrived at work shortly before noon, worked a steady shift, and clocked out just after 9 in the evening. Coworkers noted nothing unusual in her demeanor. She declined a ride home, as she often did, preferring her independence. Her car was seen exiting the parking lot by a security camera at a nearby store, a grainy image that confirmed timing but little else. From there, investigators charted the most logical route to her apartment, a familiar drive she had taken hundreds of times. The pull-off where her car was later found sat several miles off that route. To reach it required a conscious turn, not a wrong turn. Detectives canvassed the area repeatedly, knocking on doors even when residents were weary of questions. Rural Vermont culture values privacy, yet cooperation remained strong. People remembered headlights on snow, the sound of an engine idling, the absence of other traffic. One resident reported hearing a vehicle stop briefly near the pull-off around 10 p.m., then drive away. The time estimate was imprecise, but aligned with Emily's likely arrival. Another mentioned seeing a utility-style truck earlier that evening, but records showed no maintenance scheduled in that sector. Each lead was logged, cross-referenced, and either set aside or pursued. The autopsy findings guided theory without dictating conclusions. The absence of defensive injuries suggested surprise or compliance. Investigators considered scenarios that would prompt a young woman to pull over voluntarily on a cold December night. A perceived authority figure, a request for assistance, or concern for another motorist ranked highest. No evidence supported mechanical failure of her car. The engine started without issue when recovered. Fuel levels were adequate. Tire tracks near the pull-off indicated at least 2 vehicles had been present, though snow degradation limited precision. Casts were taken, measurements recorded, and comparisons attempted with known vehicles in the area. Media coverage in early 2000 remained measured. The local paper ran follow-ups emphasizing official statements and community impact. There was no frenzy, only a steady drumbeat of concern. For older readers, many of whom remembered earlier decades when crimes of this nature were rarer, the case unsettled assumptions about safety. Letters to the editor called for vigilance rather than speculation. Law enforcement appreciated the restraint, knowing that public trust aided cooperation. As winter turned to spring, physical searches resumed in areas previously inaccessible. Dive teams re-examined sections of the river after thaw, ensuring nothing had been missed. Evidence logs were reviewed for completeness. The partial fingerprint from Emily's car, though insufficient for identification, was entered into state records. Fiber analysis suggested synthetic material commonly used in vehicle upholstery. It was not distinctive enough to point to a make or model, but it reinforced the working theory of a second vehicle. Investigators interviewed registered owners of similar vehicles within a defined radius, a time-consuming process that yielded little. By summer, the investigation reached a plateau. Supervisors authorized a full case review, assigning a fresh pair of eyes to the file. This detective, experienced in unsolved cases, approached the material without assumptions. He questioned why Emily's scarf remained neatly placed. He revisited the timeline around the pull-off, noting that it was one of the few spots along that stretch where a vehicle could stop without blocking traffic. He also examined reports of seasonal workers in the area, individuals whose transient presence often complicated investigations. Employment records were requested from businesses operating late hours that winter. One name surfaced briefly during this phase, attached to a man who had worked short-term jobs and left the state in early 2000. At the time, nothing tied him directly to Emily beyond proximity and opportunity. Without forensic linkage, the lead could not advance. It was documented and filed, one of many threads left hanging. By late 2000, with no arrests forthcoming, the case was formally classified as cold, though periodic review remained mandated. Years passed with quiet persistence. Advances in forensic science altered investigative landscapes nationwide. DNA databases expanded. Techniques improved sensitivity. Vermont participated cautiously, balancing innovation with legal safeguards. Emily Harper's evidence remained preserved, its integrity maintained by careful storage. Detectives rotated, but institutional memory held. Each December around the anniversary, the file was reopened, notes added, theories reconsidered. For those working the case, it became a measure of professional patience. In 2014, a statewide cold case task force formed, pooling resources and expertise. Emily's case was among the first selected due to the preserved biological sample. Analysts extracted a more complete profile using methods unavailable in 1999. The profile was entered into national systems, producing no immediate hits. Investigators then pursued familial searching under judicial authorization, a process involving genetic markers suggesting potential relatives. This approach required meticulous documentation to withstand scrutiny. The breakthrough came quietly, without fanfare. A partial familial association pointed toward a family line with ties to New England. One member had lived in Vermont briefly at the relevant time. Records placed him within commuting distance of the pull-off. His work history showed night shifts and irregular hours. Vehicle registration records from the late 1990s listed a truck matching the general tire pattern documented years earlier. None of this constituted proof, but together it warranted closer examination. Investigators reconstructed his movements using archived data, piecing together a mosaic from payroll stubs, rental agreements, and traffic stops. They re-interviewed former coworkers, now scattered across states. Memory had faded, but one recalled a comment about helping someone late one night near a wooded road. The statement, insignificant years earlier, gained weight in context. A lawful request for a DNA sample was pursued after establishing probable cause. The sample matched the profile from Emily's case with statistical certainty. Arrest planning prioritized discretion. The suspect was taken into custody without incident, decades after the crime. The news reached Vermont slowly, then all at once. Local papers broke the story with sober headlines. For older residents, the passage of time between crime and arrest underscored a belief in methodical justice. Court filings detailed the evidence chain, emphasizing legality and procedure. There were no dramatic revelations, only accumulated facts aligning. As pretrial proceedings unfolded, prosecutors prepared to present a narrative built on forensic linkage and corroborated timeline. Defense motions challenged methodology, as expected, but rulings upheld the admissibility of evidence. In the end, the strength of the case led to a guilty plea. The courtroom atmosphere during sentencing was subdued. Statements focused on loss and accountability rather than anger. Emily Harper's life was summarized in official language, her age frozen at 22. After sentencing, the case returned to the archives, this time marked resolved. The file was thicker, heavier with years, yet complete. For the investigators who had carried it through seasons and careers, there was no celebration. Only the quiet acknowledgement that diligence, preserved evidence, and evolving science had converged. Outside, another Vermont winter approached, wreaths again appearing on courthouse doors, the town moving forward with memory intact. The resolution of the legal process did not end the work associated with the case, because closure in a cold investigation extends beyond a conviction. Following sentencing, state police conducted a comprehensive after-action review, a standard but often overlooked step intended to document lessons learned. The Emily Harper investigation became a reference file for evidence preservation, seasonal disappearance response, and intergenerational continuity within law enforcement. Older detectives who had worked the case in its earliest months met with newer personnel, walking through the file page by page. The winter of 1999 was revisited not emotionally, but analytically, reinforcing how early assumptions had been tested and corrected over time. For the community, the arrest altered long-held perceptions. Vermont towns often measure time by winters rather than years, and this case had endured through more than 20 of them. Men who had followed the story in their 40s were now retired, reading the final headlines with a perspective shaped by age and experience. The local press revisited its own archives, republishing original articles beside modern updates. The tone remained restrained. There were no celebratory words, only acknowledgement that an unanswered question had finally been addressed. Editorials emphasized patience, the value of records, and the necessity of allowing investigators to work without pressure for spectacle. Emily Harper's parents declined public appearances beyond a written statement, choosing privacy consistent with their conduct throughout the decades. They had attended every major procedural milestone quietly, sitting through hearings without outward display. Friends who had once taped flyers to store windows now gathered in smaller circles, reflecting on the passage of time. The holiday season, which had framed both the disappearance and the arrest announcement, carried layered meaning. Christmas lights still lined Main Street, but they illuminated a town more aware of fragility beneath tradition. The investigative timeline, once finalized, revealed how close the case had come to remaining unsolved. Had the biological evidence not been properly stored, advances in DNA analysis would have been irrelevant. Had the partial fingerprint been discarded as unusable, corroboration would have weakened. Had seasonal worker records not been retained by employers, movement reconstruction would have stalled. Each small administrative decision, made without knowledge of future breakthroughs, proved consequential. This realization informed policy updates within the department, particularly regarding long-term evidence retention in rural jurisdictions. The suspect's background was examined in court documents with care, avoiding conjecture. He had lived an unremarkable life following his departure from Vermont, holding steady employment and avoiding serious criminal charges. This fact unsettled some observers, challenging assumptions about visible markers of guilt. For investigators, it reinforced the principle that behavior after a crime does not always conform to expectation. The absence of subsequent offenses did not negate past actions, nor did it simplify motive. The case file avoided speculation, focusing instead on verified actions and physical linkage. Autopsy documentation, once sealed, was reviewed internally to ensure consistency with prosecutorial findings. Medical examiners confirmed that conclusions reached in 1999 remained accurate under modern standards. This continuity mattered, affirming that foundational forensic work had been sound despite technological limitations of the era. It also offered reassurance to Emily's family that no critical errors had delayed justice unnecessarily. In cold cases, doubt about early procedures often compounds grief. Here, the record held. The courthouse itself became a symbol in retrospective coverage. Built of stone and wood, it had witnessed countless proceedings, yet few spanned such a temporal arc. Older residents remembered walking its halls decades earlier for civic duties unrelated to crime. Now they read about its role in delivering finality to a case that had lingered like an unfinished sentence. The seasonal decorations hung during sentencing echoed those present when Emily disappeared, an unintentional but poignant symmetry noted by several commentators. Law enforcement agencies beyond Vermont requested briefings on the case, particularly regarding the integration of genealogical databases within constitutional boundaries. Presentations emphasized judicial oversight, transparency, and restraint. The Emily Harper case was cited as an example of how emerging tools could complement, not replace, traditional investigative discipline. There were no shortcuts, only cumulative effort across years. For officers nearing retirement, participation in these briefings offered professional closure akin to personal resolution. The rural landscape where Emily's car had been found changed little over the decades. Trees grew taller, roadside signage weathered, but the pull-off remained largely the same. Investigators visited the site one final time after the case closed, not as part of evidence collection, but as a matter of record. Photographs were taken to document current conditions, then filed away. The visit was brief, procedural, and quiet. No markers were placed. The intention was not memorialization, but completion. In the months following sentencing, crime statistics resumed their usual patterns in local reporting. Emily's case receded from front pages, replaced by routine concerns. This return to normalcy was itself a measure of resolution. Cold cases often distort community narratives, lingering as unresolved chapters. When closed, they allow attention to move forward without erasure of memory. Emily Harper's name remained known, but no longer as a question. For the generation of men who had followed the case closely, many of whom had raised families during the same years the investigation lay dormant, the outcome reinforced beliefs about persistence. Letters sent to the editor spoke of faith in process rather than emotion. Some referenced their own experiences with loss and waiting, recognizing parallels without conflating them. The case became a quiet lesson rather than a cautionary tale. The final administrative act involved sealing certain documents while releasing others under public records law. Transparency, balanced against privacy, guided these decisions. What was released allowed independent verification of investigative claims, meeting the standard of lawful resolution. What remained sealed protected personal details irrelevant to public understanding. This balance ensured that the story, when told, remained factual and restrained. As another Thanksgiving passed and winter again approached, Vermont settled into familiar rhythms. Snow returned, muffling roads and softening edges. The Harper case, once defined by absence, now rested within the archive as a complete record. There were no loose ends, no unanswered procedural questions. Justice, delayed but intact, had been delivered without spectacle. The quiet aftermath reflected the character of the place, and the people who had waited through many seasons for an answer that finally arrived. The years following the formal close of the case revealed how deeply a single unresolved crime can shape professional culture inside a small state agency. Training curricula for Vermont investigators were updated to include a detailed walkthrough of the Emily Harper investigation, not as a dramatic narrative but as a procedural study. Recruits were shown copies of the original evidence logs, weather reports, and interview summaries from 1999. Instructors emphasized how routine decisions made during the first 48 hours had preserved options decades later. The lesson was deliberate patience, a principle that resonated strongly with officers who understood that many of their cases might outlive their careers. For veteran investigators, the Harper case also served as a reminder of restraint. Early public pressure had been minimal, allowing detectives to work without distortion from speculation. This environment contrasted with more modern cases shaped by rapid news cycles. During internal discussions, supervisors noted how the absence of sensational coverage in 1999 had prevented premature conclusions. Evidence had been allowed to speak at its own pace. That discipline, they argued, was as critical as technology. Community memory evolved alongside institutional reflection. In Rutland County, informal conversations shifted tone once the case was solved. For years, Emily Harper's disappearance had been referenced cautiously, often as a warning or an unresolved sadness tied to winter roads and dark evenings. After conviction, those references changed. Her name was spoken with finality rather than uncertainty. Older residents, particularly men who had followed the case through local newspapers, expressed a sense of order restored. Not optimism, but balance. Local historians documented the case within a broader chronicle of the county's late 20th century history. It was contextualized among economic transitions, demographic shifts, and the gradual modernization of rural infrastructure. The cold case was not isolated but placed within its time, when DNA databases were young and interstate data sharing was limited. This framing helped newer generations understand why resolution had taken so long, without assigning blame to individuals or agencies. Emily Harper's personal history, once summarized briefly in missing person notices, was revisited with care. Public records confirmed her academic pursuits, employment consistency, and volunteer work during high school. These details were not used to romanticize her life, but to establish context. Investigators maintained that understanding who a victim was mattered, even decades later, because it informed why deviations from routine were significant. Her reliability had been the alarm that first signaled something was wrong. The suspect's guilty plea closed the door on unanswered legal questions, but it did not erase the investigative effort that followed arrest. Detectives ensured that all corroborating materials were independently reviewed, anticipating scrutiny from external analysts. Chain of custody documentation was audited line by line. Laboratory certifications from both the original forensic work and the modern DNA testing were attached to the file. This level of detail was not required after conviction, but it was considered essential for institutional integrity. In discussions with prosecutors, law enforcement leaders reflected on the importance of plea resolution in cases spanning decades. Trials risk fatting memories and unavailable witnesses, even when forensic evidence is strong. The guilty plea in this case preserved judicial resources while still establishing accountability. For Emily's family, it prevented the reopening of painful details. For the public, it provided a lawful conclusion without uncertainty. The physical artifacts associated with the case were handled deliberately. Evidence items no longer required for appeals were inventoried, and where appropriate, retained for historical reference under controlled conditions. Others were destroyed according to statute, a process witnessed and documented. These actions marked a definitive end to active investigation. The file was transferred from the cold case unit to the closed cases archive, its status updated in state and national systems. Seasonal symbolism continued to frame reflection. The fact that Emily disappeared during the build-up to Christmas and that the arrest occurred nearly 2 decades later in winter was not lost on observers. Investigators acknowledged this privately but resisted drawing meaning beyond chronology. In official documentation, dates were recorded plainly, without commentary. The discipline of avoiding narrative embellishment was maintained even in hindsight. Community safety initiatives emerged quietly in the aftermath. Local law enforcement increased outreach regarding roadside assistance protocols and public awareness during winter travel. These efforts were not directly attributed to the Harper case, but were informed by its lessons. The message emphasized caution without fear, preparedness without alarm. For an aging population accustomed to self-reliance, the approach was practical rather than prescriptive. Media retrospectives published 1 year after sentencing focused less on the crime itself and more on the process that led to resolution. Journalists interviewed forensic specialists about advances in DNA technology, explaining them in accessible terms. They highlighted the importance of warrants and oversight in genealogical searches, addressing privacy concerns. This educational framing aligned with the community's preference for information over sensation. Emily Harper's name entered official remembrance through quieter means. A scholarship fund was established in her honor at a local institution, supporting students pursuing forensic science or criminal justice. The fund was modest, sustained by private donations rather than public campaigns. Its existence reflected a desire to transform loss into contribution without spectacle. Within law enforcement circles, the case influenced career trajectories. Younger detectives who assisted in the later stages cited the experience as formative, reinforcing commitment to unresolved investigations. Older officers nearing retirement described the resolution as professionally validating, proof that long-term diligence mattered even when immediate results were absent. The case bridged generations within the agency. As Vermont moved further into the 21st century, the Harper investigation remained cited occasionally in training and policy discussions, but it no longer dominated conversation. Its lessons were absorbed into standard practice. Snow continued to fall each winter, roads continued to be cleared, and holiday lights continued to glow against early darkness. The difference lay in knowledge rather than atmosphere. The final measure of closure appeared in subtle ways. Missing person flyers were removed from archival displays, replaced with documentation of resolution. Digital databases updated status fields from unresolved to solved. These administrative actions, though mundane, signaled completion. The case was no longer waiting. In the quiet aftermath, Emily Harper's story settled into Vermont's collective memory as an example of endurance rather than tragedy alone. The crime had been answered, the process verified, and the outcome recorded. What remained was a community that had waited, an investigation that had persisted, and a conclusion reached through lawful, methodical means after many winters had passed. The closing chapter of the Vermont 1999 case unfolded not with ceremony, but with the slow settling that follows a long-held tension finally released. After decades of uncertainty, the investigative record reached a point where nothing more needed to be added, only preserved. The case file, once reopened each winter with cautious hope, was now complete. For those who had lived alongside the unanswered question, the resolution reshaped memory itself, transforming a lingering absence into a documented truth. In the months after sentencing, Vermont State Police completed the final statutory reviews required in homicide cases, ensuring that appellate timelines, victim notification protocols, and record disclosures were satisfied. There were no appeals filed. The guilty plea stood uncontested, supported by forensic evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny even decades after collection. The integrity of the investigation, from 1999 through resolution, became a quiet point of professional pride, not spoken loudly but recognized internally. Emily Harper's name appeared one last time in a court docket entry marking the case closed. The language was procedural, devoid of emotion, yet weighty in its finality. For her family, this entry meant there would be no further court dates, no more waiting for phone calls from prosecutors, no renewed exposure to uncertainty. The absence that had defined so many Decembers was no longer paired with unanswered questions. It remained a loss, but no longer an unresolved one. The rural character of the region shaped how the aftermath unfolded. There were no public memorials unveiled, no official ceremonies. Instead, closure arrived in private ways. A headstone inscription was quietly updated. A church bulletin included a brief line acknowledging the end of a long journey. Conversations in diners and general stores referenced the case less frequently, and when it was mentioned, it was spoken of in the past tense, firmly placed behind the present. For men who had followed the case since its earliest reporting, many now in their 60s or 70s, the resolution carried particular resonance. They remembered the winter of 1999 clearly, the shock of learning that a young woman had vanished during a season associated with family and safety. They remembered reading updates over morning coffee, scanning newspapers for developments that never came. The final outcome affirmed a belief held quietly over years, that persistence, even when invisible, still mattered. Law enforcement leadership documented the Harper case as part of a broader evaluation of cold case strategies. The conclusion reinforced a fundamental principle that evidence, if respected and preserved, retains value beyond the limitations of its era. The case demonstrated that time does not erode truth when procedure is followed. This understanding influenced budget decisions, storage upgrades, and staffing models across the state, ensuring that other unresolved cases would benefit from the same long view. The suspect, now serving his sentence, faded from public attention quickly. There were no interviews, no attempts to explain or contextualize his actions beyond the established facts. The court record stood as the definitive account. Vermont's approach resisted the urge to assign narrative meaning beyond evidence. The focus remained on what was known, proven, and lawfully concluded. Emily Harper's life, though short, was reclaimed from abstraction through careful documentation. Investigators and archivists ensured that her story was preserved accurately, not sensationalized. Her routine, her reliability, and her presence within the community were recorded alongside the facts of her death. This balance mattered, especially in a case that spanned generations. It ensured that she was remembered as a person, not only as a case number. The physical landscape bore quiet witness to the passage of time. The road where her car had been found remained unchanged, used daily by drivers unaware of its history. Snow continued to fall there each winter, covering and uncovering the ground in steady cycles. The river flowed as it always had, indifferent to human timelines. Investigators acknowledged this constancy privately, recognizing that while cases close, places endure. As the archives absorbed the final documents, the Harper file joined a distinct category reserved for solved cold cases. These files were not retired entirely. They were referenced, studied, and occasionally reopened for academic or training purposes. Yet their status was different. They no longer carried unanswered questions, only lessons. The Harper case became one such lesson, cited for its disciplined early response and its ultimate reliance on preserved evidence. The local press marked the anniversary of the resolution once, then moved on. Coverage emphasized closure rather than retrospection. Readers responded with subdued affirmation. There was no appetite for revisiting pain, only acknowledgement that a long chapter had ended. In this restraint, the character of the community remained evident. For Emily's parents, the finality allowed a shift in how time was measured. Years previously defined by waiting gave way to years marked by remembrance rather than uncertainty. Their statement, released after sentencing, remained the only public reflection they offered. It thanked investigators and acknowledged the passage of time without bitterness. It reflected acceptance rather than relief. The Vermont 1999 cold case solved designation became more than a headline. It stood as evidence that even in small communities, with limited resources and harsh winters, justice could persist quietly. The arrest that shocked the community did so not because of spectacle, but because it arrived after patience had nearly become resignation. That shock faded into understanding, then into record. As another winter approached, wreaths again appeared on courthouse doors, and snow again softened the edges of roads and buildings. Life continued as it always had, yet beneath the seasonal rhythm lay the knowledge that one of the community's longest-held questions had been answered. The case was no longer a whisper of what might have happened, but a documented account of what did. In the end, the story resolved without fanfare, exactly as it had been investigated. Methodical, lawful, verified. The quiet aftermath matched the character of the place and the people who had waited through many seasons. Emily Harper's name remained, no longer suspended in uncertainty, but grounded in truth, recorded permanently within the history of Vermont.